Audio here. My name is Craig Boslow, and I'm the chairman of the board of FUDR, and would like to welcome you to 2021 WWE. I'd like to start off by thanking our staff. So Jeff Skelding, who's our executive director, Sherry Resty Thomas, Molly Oliver, and Rochelle Dufton, who you'll be seeing in and out during today's and Thursday's meetings. The staff does an incredible job and really is what makes this thing work. So I can't thank them enough for their efforts and all they do. They've been very busy. FUDR has grown exponentially over the last 10 years, and really over the last 3 to 4 years, we've tripled our budget as we've expanded our scope of services and our partnerships with grants with local municipalities, stream restoration activities. We've got the One Bug, which is our annual fundraiser that brings people in from all over the country. So a lot going on, and we're proud of what we've been able to do for a small organization out of Hancock, New York. And we'd like to thank all of you who are taking the time to participate here and present. I'd like to recognize a few board members that have transitioned to emeritus status over the last couple of years. These folks have made significant contributions to FUDR. Dan Plummer, who is the former chairman. Dan, I'm sure, is in attendance here. Joe DeMalderis, Lee Hartman, Bob Bachman, and Al Cucci. Those folks continue to serve actively on committees for us, but I'd like to recognize them for their efforts and contributions over the course of time here, because the organization, as you all know, started as a small group of passionate fishermen, and it has progressed into a 21 board membership of fairly eclectic and diverse professional backgrounds, and so way more sophisticated, and depth of reach has grown in size and scope. And so again, really proud of how far we've come over the course of time here. Would also like to take the opportunity to recognize Peter Colasar, who will be presenting here shortly. Peter was just recently recognized by the Catskill Museum and Fly Fishing Center for his contributions over the course of time. As we know, Peter is one of the brightest people all of us know, and his models of releases and science-based presentations that have warranted recognition and merit. So with that, I'd like to introduce Jeff Skelding, our executive director, as he gives introduction and some housekeeping information.
Great, thanks, Craig. Thanks everybody for coming. I want to again recognize FUDR staff, Molly, Sherry, and Shell. And as Dan said to many of you on email yesterday, happy birthday to Sherry. It's been a whole weekend of Sherry Resty Thomas' birthday. Lots of fun. We got out on the river yesterday a little bit, and all happy birthday, Sherry. We love you. So we tried to hopefully we put the agenda in the chat box. Hopefully everybody knows how to use that. Just hit chat at the bottom and you can click on the agenda if you haven't seen it. We tried to cover as best we could all of the really topical and most important issues that are facing our river these days. And it's always tough to cram stuff into a short amount of time, but we do it every year. We split the conference this year simply because we had scheduling problems with or scheduling challenges with a few speakers. So we decided, because we're doing it by Zoom, why not just do it Tuesday and Thursday rather than 2 consecutive days. We tried to keep it down to a manageable amount of hours. We know it's a little hard to sit in front of your computer for 5 hours. We understand if you have to go do other things, take a break, that sort of thing. We wish we could be face to face, but these days this is how it's going. So a handful of housekeeping items. We are recording the session, as you heard, so people, if you miss a section of it, and you'll have a chance to go to our website and go back and review and listen. We ask everybody to stay on mute. If you stay on mute during the presentations, We're going to have a question and answer session at the end of each presentation. Hopefully the speakers will make time for that. And you can also use the chat box, and Molly will be managing the chat box and taking a look at the questions, and we can ask questions of the presenters when they're done. But during their speaking, if you could, everybody would be on mute. That's gonna work best. He also is a raise your hand function too. A couple of options if you have questions for each session. Let's see. Sherry's you might see Sherry jump in if any of our speakers go along, and let them know that we need to stay on time here to respect everybody's time. Those of you who are speakers and have PowerPoints, you've already been instructed that you'll be a co-host, so you'll be in charge of your own PowerPoints. If you have any concerns about that, you can just email Sherry. But hopefully you got the message beforehand and you're prepared to go. Lunch is on your own today. You can log out at noon and log back in at 1. So with that, we're going to get a little bit of an early start. And that's good. That's always good because we're always crammed for time, it seems like. So our first session is a sort of a number of topics associated with the management of the New York City reservoirs, which is always top of mind for so many people in our membership and our constituency. And I think we've got 4 issues that are really important for us to learn more about and stay on top of. The first one is we're going to talk about here is the thermal relief protocol. But we're in the 2nd year of our relatively new thermal relief program pursuant to the 2017 FFMP. And we've got 2 speakers today that are really, really on top of the issue and have been for a long time. One, I've introduced Peter Colasar before. Craig mentioned, I'm not sure Craig have mentioned the Catskill Museum Lee Wolf Award that Peter just recently received. I know many of you are aware of that. Well-deserved, Peter. Just awesome work for decades around reservoir management, tailwaters fishery, water quality, habitat protection. Peter's just a real, at this point, I think a real folk hero in the Upper Delaware River. And there's not enough time to list his academic credentials and accomplishments, but I'll just say that in our world, he's really, was a prime architect of the flexible flow management program and has been a top leader in ensuring that the river is protected and reservoirs are managed in a sensible way that ensures a safe water supply for New York City, but also maximizes protections for our wild trout fishery below the dam. So Peter, congratulations on your award. And he'll be joined by Brennan Terrier, who is our engineer from New York State Department of Environmental Conservation in the Division of Water. Brennan, I hope you're on the phone. I know Peter was trying to track you down. Brennan is the technician that kind of makes sure, he keeps, believe it or not, he sits up in Albany in a desk in Albany, but he watches our river all the time. And he's always looking at that gauge at Lordville. And he's always, on top of, air temperatures, water temperatures, and what, when we need a thermal release. Brennan's the guy that crunches the numbers and makes the calculations. And it's a real tight exercise because as you'll learn here in a second, we don't have, there's not a ton of water to use in the bank. And sometimes we have hot summers. And so Brennan can be pressured to, use that water in the most efficient way. And really, from our experience, we've seen that he really is on top of it and hits that number pretty regularly. So with that, Peter, I think you're ready to go. And you can take over from here. Thanks for coming and congratulations again on your award.
Well, thank you. And thank you very much for those kind words. Everyone on this call will appreciate how much this has been a team effort and a kind of, while not joined at the hip, we have been collaborating since at least 2008 on all these issues. So it's a joint effort. And I can't overstate the importance of FUDR and being the activist organization that really has helped us turn some abstract ideas into actual policies and has built bridges with the political arms. That's been so important. Also really important to me right now is to check, is Brennan on?
Yeah, I'm here, Peter.
Oh, wonderful. Hey, great. I had a moment of anxiety there. I tried calling, it didn't get you.
Oh,
Okay,
sorry.
So here's the game plan is I prepared some slides and Brennan and I have discussed them. What I'm going to do is make the introductory comments and give an overview of what happened and more or less why it happened from the macro view. And then I'll turn it over to Brennan, who will discuss the 3 primary thermal episodes that happened during the summer. And then I'll close out with a few observations, comments, and suggestions, some of which may be somewhat controversial. As always, I take a pretty personal stand and sometimes a strong stand. So that may provoke some discussion. So having said that, I think it's now time for me to share my screen. And we bring up presentation. Here we go. Turn into presentation and off we go. So thermal mitigation experience, summer 2021. Peter Colasar from Columbia and Brennan Terrier, the implementer. And by the way, more than the implementer, Brennan is the man who represents New York State most of the time in the RFAC committees and has appeared before SEF. So he certainly is the guy who administers the program, but he's played a very, very big role in its architecture as well. Little background. Almost everyone on the call here has been somewhat familiar with the FFMP. 2017, a few years back, included a provision for thermal mitigation with a target which has always been controversial, but it's with us and we're working with it. It's to keep the daily maximum temperatures at 75 or below at Lordville by pulses of cold water out of Cannonsville. That's the program. It has a limited amount of water, a bank size of 2,500 CFS days that in a kind of peculiar way is set on June 1st of the year and carries over to May 31st of the following calendar year, which we may discuss later on, implications of that. The use of the bank is at the discretion of New York State DEC, and that is in the person of Brennan. So while there are guidelines and some rules, Brennan is the man who each morning has to make a decision about whether water is to be released and how much is to be released. We in the fishing community are blessed with having had the opportunity to have a significant voice, not the only voice, but a significant voice in the architecture through the DRBC Subcommittee on Ecological Flows. So both FUDR, Trout Unlimited, and others of us have been representative. Jeff, Garth Pettinger, Bob Bachman, Jim Serio, and myself are among the 13 SEF members. As you all know, we have this target of 75-degree max at Lordville. The real idea there is to protect the reach of the upper Delaware main stem from Hancock to Lordville. And the findings are that if you can keep 75 max at Lordville, you do a pretty good job at protecting that reach, which has always been our objective. Now, I want to start this way. What in heck do we face? So I'd like you to imagine that you are Brennan, and it is 8:30 in the morning, and you look at your gauges and you see that Lordville was at 1,700 CFS and 74 degrees yesterday. You look at the gauges and you see that the Cannonsville release was 621. You look at the gauges, you see the Fish's Eddy release, not release, but flow was 278, and the temperature there was 78. Binghamton forecast for today for the high and low are 81 degrees high, 70 low, and for tomorrow, 84, 69. What do you do? This is the challenge that Brennan faces in trying to implement this program. And I wanted to get across to you the complexity of the issues here, and that the guidelines are just guidelines, but that every single day, very difficult decisions have to be made. And to emphasize to all of us when we tend to complain that these are gambles. You're in a casino. You have a certain amount of money in your pocket. You have to gamble as to whether to spend it now or later, hold on to it for the rest of the season or not. It's a very, very difficult problem. Now let me get back into talking about 2021. We'll come back to those facts a little bit later on. We were fortunate. It was an easy summer thermally. First of all, we had a lot of water. This is a chart of the reservoir levels throughout the summer, and you can see by the blue line here that we have always been essentially at or above the long run median. So the gap between the blue line and the yellow line is the amount of water that's available to be used, and has been certainly ample to do anything that reasonably needed to be done. We were fortunate this year. Every summer isn't like that. The weather as a driver, as reflected in the reservoir levels, the precipitation was high. So May, July, and August were well above normal, and June was just a little bit below. So a lot of water coming into the reservoirs. Even more important than that, the water comes into the river as well. Temperature as a driver. This was not a really bad summer thermally. If you look at the row of 2021, we see that June was higher than average. July a little bit lower. August a little bit high. Very important to us, we know from our research, were days above 80 degrees. And so we did have a kind of tough summer thermally, but there was enough water around to overcome those difficulties. Here's the experience that we had. There were 7 relief requests made by Brennan and the DEC. All those requests are posted on the Rivermaster website. You can get all the details there. That's where my data comes from. Mitigation releases were made over 6 days, and they used, fortunately, only about 650 CFS days of water out of our bank of 2,500. So this means that we have 1,850 CFS days in the bank, and what's very important to realize is that water is there in the bank for use in May of the coming year. We're very fortunate this year. What happened? Lordville temperatures were kept below 75 through the summer. They actually kept themselves below 75 pretty much without too much intervention, except on 2 days during a June heat wave, June 29th and June 30th, when they got above 75, but not very much above, thanks to actions taken by Brennan on and before those days. I made an estimate of what would have happened had there been no thermal releases using the statistical model that I've built, and found that perhaps 1 or 2 additional days would have gone above 75, and that the 2 days that we're really concerned about, June 29th and June 30th, would have been approximately another degree Fahrenheit higher, just about. Also, I know many in the audience are concerned about other criteria, so I particularly examined a 72 daily average limit. It is not included in the FFMP as a criteria. Many of us are concerned about it, and what I find that is, in general, when the 75 max criteria is met, the 72 daily average criteria is also met, so we don't have to really worry too much about that. Again, there would have been 2 exceedances. There were 2 exceedances of that criteria, which again happened on those 2 critical days, June 29th and June 30th. Here's a picture of what happened. I grouped the difficult days into 3 episodes. Early June, roughly around June 6th, June 8th, let's call it episode 1. essentially a kind of false alarm there. It looked like a situation was going to get bad. Brennan made a small thermal release and we got through it. He'll be discussing that in a few moments. More difficult was episode 2, the end of June. That period that includes the June 29th, June 30th dates. And you can, if you can see my cursor, I'm pointing out to you the 2 days that went above the 75 limit. And you can see that mercifully, they did not exceed it very much. It would have been considerably higher, at least another full degree Fahrenheit higher had there not been the thermal releases. And then episode 3 toward the middle of August, around August 8th, August 10th. So there's an overview of kind of what happened, somewhat of a success, I would say. Now, something I've been doing for years now is using Fish's Eddy as a benchmark. Fish's Eddy and Lordville are subject to basically the same thermal conditions, and they move up and down in coordination. And when, in order for us to test the effect of thermal releases, you look for whether the thermal mitigation induced a gap between Fish's Eddy and Lordville. And it's really evident in this chart in episode 2. Notice the yellow, which is Fish's Eddy, and how much higher that is than Lordville, which is just slightly above the red line. I attribute that very exactly to the thermal release. So we've been doing that for years. I continue to keep a tally on that. At the bottom of the screen, you will see a table I constructed, and this is consistent with other years. We're getting about a 2.2 degree centigrade gain from doing the thermal mitigation. We had 6 days with thermal mitigation, 86 days without, and the gain is about 2.2 degrees, which I think is evidence that the thermal mitigation is working successfully in the direction that we wanted. This chart simply shows the evidence of my statement earlier that when you protect at Lordville for the maximum, you protect at Lordville for the average. So the blue line are the Lordville maximums. The benchmark for that is to keep it below 75. A lot of us would like to see water temperatures below 68, and we see that when you keep Lordville maximum below 75, you keep the Lordville average below 68, and it's really kind of indicating that we are somewhat successful in protecting that reach between Hancock and Lordville that's so important to us. This next chart is even more evidence of that. I'm looking at both the Hancock maximum, the Lordville maximum, and basically we are doing the job that we like to do by the artifice of focusing on 75 degrees at Lordville. So now let me turn this talk over to Brennan, who has been administering this program, and we're going to look at the details. I have laid out 3 charts that Brennan can speak to. The first one here is a chart of what I called episode 1, which is covering in this chart June 5th to June 9th. And it shows the releases and the temperatures. Brennan, why don't you speak to what happened, what you did, and the thought process, et cetera.
Yeah, at this time it was early in the season. This is early June. So we're still getting started with the season. And one of the lessons we've learned over the past few years is that one of the biggest factors is not just the air temperature during the day and then the preceding night, but also the cloud cover. Days where there's little cloud cover and you get a lot of that sun loading, the thermal loading all day, that can be a big factor. A cloudy day can be fine at relatively high temperatures, but a sunny day can be in the danger zone when it's not really quite that warm. It doesn't have to be 95 degrees out if it's full sun all day. So at the beginning of the season, it was still sort of a bit proactive, I say. I made a mistake here, and as I told Peter, it's kind of like you're coming off the bench and you want to make a big play. You want to be aggressive. At this point on the 6th, so that's June 6th, the forecast for that day was 90 and sunny. And then there was going to be an overnight low of 64. And generally, an overnight low of 64, you're in pretty good shape. You're getting a lot of good cooling overnight. It's bringing down the temperature for the main stem and the east and west branch. So you're getting some heat dissipation there. And then the forecast for the next day was 89, and again with full sun. So I was a bit too aggressive. I thought that the sun was kind of skewing the metrics. A lot of the problems we've had with our regressions and simulations in the past is that the cloud cover was not always included in that historical data. So a lot of that scatter, you look at 2 days in the historical record with similar flows and similar temperatures, and there's a lot of deviation in the outcome. A lot of that is due to the cloud cover. It doesn't show that, July 17th, 1998 was very sunny, and a similar day was not sunny at all. So once you take that cloud cover into effect, you're getting better results. But here, it was kind of my fear of the sun the next day, that you're going to have a long day, you're going to have a high sun angle, and you're going to have a lot of loading. So on this day, I requested an increase of 100 CFS. So the base release was 500 here. And then I requested an increase to 600 for 12 hours. And it turned out that was pretty unnecessary. As you can see from the temperature curve there, we didn't really get past 73 by much. But that's the story of this one. And this has happened a couple of years where in early June, I'm a little too aggressive. And I think that's kind of something I have to factor into next year, that trust the numbers, be cautious and take into all the factors into effect, but also early June heat waves are not that common. I think part of the reason for that is that you're still having a lot of cold inputs. Your groundwater inputs are still probably pretty cold. You're still getting cold nights, but that's the story here.
Okay, let me just point out, the next story is going to be even more interesting. Just point out what you guys should be looking at. The orange line here that I'm tracing with the cursor is the release from Stylesville, and you see the bump that Brennan called for. And what you see when you look at the flow at Lordville, you see there's a lot of water there. And then that 13 hours later, that bump shows up as just a little bump. And so there isn't really an enormous effect. I think we're going to see the next slide is going to be, and Brennan's discussion is going to be even more interesting. So let's pass to that. Episode number 2, quite a bit more complicated and more interesting. Brennan, take it over again.
Yeah, this was a more complicated episode. Now we're really in the heart of the summer here. The July 4th weekend has always been a challenge. We're still at a base 500 release, so that's where we're starting from. On the 26th, we again had a forecast the next day for a 90-degree day. Oh, another thing is here you see the Lordville temperature is getting very low. Or the Lordville flow, we're getting down close to below 1100. That's a real critical factor. When you get below 1100, and 500 of that is from the Cannonsville. So all of your East Branch flow there is getting it's kind of starting to dominate the Beaverkill and East Branch. They're getting low, they're getting hot. And so that's starting to contribute there. So the forecast was for the next day being 90, and here it says partly sunny. That's always, you're partly sunny, you're mostly sunny. Those are, there's a lot of wiggle room there between when the clouds show up. So like Peter said, there's a lot of uncertainty in these forecasts that they're not as specific that we would want given, perfect after knowledge. But on the 26th, I kind of eased into it. I requested an increase to 550, and I just wanted to continue this over the day because the forecast for days coming up was going to be hot. We were at the front end of a heat wave here, where the next day, the next day was going to be 90 and sunny, but then days 2 and 3 was forecast for 93, 94. So I kind of wanted to get a head start on it. I increased it to 550 and just wanted to maintain this as a base. So it wasn't a 12-hour pulse like I had requested back on the 6th. It was just going to be maintained and kind of setting the stage for the next day. The next day on the 27th, it was very hot. Let me find here. So on the 27th, it was expected that that day was going to be 91, and the next day was going to be 93, full sun with an overnight low of 68. That was really getting concerning. Even though we had the pulse the day before, we still had seen a big delta there. You see the change between on the gray line, between the low and the high. That was a pretty big delta that shot up there with even with the plus 50. So I requested increase to 800. That's that big first bump you see on the orange line. And then with the time of travel, that brings it over to the next day in the blue line.
Yeah.
And
Let me
800 is
point
a lot
out,
of.
Bernie, let me interject to say, here's where Brendan has gotten really creative. In our original analysis of thermal relief, we've been presuming in most of the statistics doing something like a 24-hour bump. And Brendan has been making these like 12-hour bumps. And what they seem to do, they seem to be effective at catching the peak. So you see that he's got here these 3 12-hour bumps, and that's a very interesting and creative strategy. That you could see the impact there, and the difference between the gray and the green lines, how effectively we're basically keeping Lordville down while Fisher's Eddy is getting out of control. Without those bumps, the gray line would have been following Fisher's Eddy well above 75 degrees.
Yeah, I think that's fair to say that on the 27th, you would have had above 75 there. A quick note here. So I was maintaining 550 overnight. So that was also a thermal increase. And that is, although the RFAC recommendation did not include 72 average as a design parameter, during the meetings, there was a lot of discussion about it, that is also an important characteristic. So even though that's not one of my primary design factors, I am cognizant of it. I do try to keep those low temperatures low overnight, both to give some thermal relief to the critters in there, but also to help us out for the next day. That if we can get those lows low, that you're in a better starting place at the start of the day.
Okay.
Now the
Okay.
next day was the 28th.
Oh.
Yeah, there we go. And the next day was the 28th.
Oh, let me go back. I'm sorry. Yeah.
And I kind of eased off. We had a really good response there, you see, with the gray line, that delta on the 28th, so the peak between the high and the low, it really cut that off. There's a big difference between Fisher's Eddy and Lordville there. The forecast for the next day was only 90, so it wasn't going to be 94, it was going to be 90, and we had an overnight low of 67. So I eased off. My request for the next day was only 675, again for a 12-hour pulse and maintaining 550 overnight. And that turned out to not be enough. We went over 75 there for a few hours midday. It was hot and sunny. I think if I'd gone up to 750 there, we wouldn't have had that exceedance on the 29th. And then again, we maintained the flow for 550 overnight. And then the next day, it was again, it was a heat wave. It was again hot and sunny on the 29th. and I only requested 700 on that day. Then after that 700, we brought it down to the normal base release of 500. And that 700 was also just not quite enough. We inched over there by
Mhm.
an hour. I think that day we might have gotten a little bit of rain.
Okay.
Possibly not, but if you see there was rain in the forecast. You see they're tailing off on the 30th. Here, the blue line shoots up, and the temperatures go way down. So that next day, the 30th, was pretty rainy, and that kind of ended this episode for us. We had
Yeah.
a jump in Lordville up to 1500, and the temperatures fell right down. So yeah, this is another learning experience. I think I had such good effects with that 800 that I eased off a little bit to try to conserve water. But it's not a perfect science.
Yeah. Okay. I'm watching time. I want to make sure we have some time for some discussion. So, Brendan, if it's okay, I'm going to skip these slides, but good to have in the archive for FUDR, and maybe come to kind of some concluding remarks and leave some time for questions.
Yeah, just real quick discussing the third episode. I'll try to
Okay.
be as brief as I can.
Sure.
This was an unusual one because the reservoirs were so full that they were in spill mitigation mode. So the releases were higher. The base was 600,
Mhm.
and very particularly, the release from Pepacton was 300. And going back in the historical record, there were very few episodes when they are that high. And really, the Pepacton flow and then the East Branch flow in general was a little higher than usual. And so that's sort of, we're really playing this by ear. This wasn't lining up with a lot of our models and our historical analysis. So this was probably an unnecessary release on the 10th and the 11th, but it still helped. I mean, it still brought the temperature down, but it wasn't the most effective use of the limited bank. Thanks. Okay. Keep going.
Okay.
Peter, this is Sherry. I'm giving you a 3-minute warning, and then we have
Okay.
5 minutes for Q&A.
Yeah. Okay, great. So this takes us back to the homework problem I gave you at the beginning. This is the kind of data that Brendan's looking at. I just wanted to hear, really put it in the archive. And what we see then is to the left, you've got the forecasts that come out of the National Weather Service. You have previous day's river data, and all of that has got to be absorbed by the decision maker in the morning to call for the actions. And emphasizing again, that's a pretty complicated job. So having done that, let me close with a couple of observations, and then we'll have time for questions. Here are my thoughts about some open issues, and everyone might not agree with these. This is somewhat personal. We need to check the adequacy of a 2,500 CFS day bank. Whether that size, which was actually an arbitrary decision by the decree parties, there's no science behind that, whether that bank is really big enough. Our analysis indicates that in a good year, in an average year, 2,500 CFS days is enough. But should we face a difficult year, there's evidence that that bank can be and should be bigger. And so I'm going to continue to push on that reevaluation as FFMP comes up for a reevaluation in 2023. Also, to check the utility of what I'll call the Brennan strategy, which is very creative, of short 8-hour, 12-hour pulses versus the 24-hour pulses. It looks like that strategy can save water, that it nips off the peak, but it might permit higher daily averages. So that deserves, I think, some additional research. It looks like a very promising idea. It's worked very well. Here, a very personal thing. Going back to 2005, Colasar has always been against the idea of a bank. I don't like banks. Banks are artificial allocations of water. They're like the Social Security Trust Fund. All actual water's in the reservoir. For example, what do you do when the bank is empty, but the reservoir is full. A very likely outcome in the spring. Suppose we use the bank or almost all the bank, we would face all of May with no water in the bank and the reservoirs possibly spilling. That is an issue that I think also deserves some attention. Finally, the next point is, again, our regression analysis, helpful as it has been, has not been really complete and taken all of the factors into consideration. We now have 3 years of experience, 3 years of more data, better forecasts provided by National Weather Service and by New York City, and we need to take advantage of that data and do some reanalysis. And then there is a concern of some CEF members about what happens downstream in the Delaware as a consequence of thermal mitigation. Is there any impact on the shad and the warm water species? We don't think so, but it deserves some attention. And then there always is the concern of many FUDR members and TU members about the feasibility of other triggers such as the 68 daily max and the 72 average, et cetera. Once again, that stuff is so important that's always deserving of additional investigation. And let me close with that and open the floor to questions.
Thank you, Peter. I see a couple of questions have come in through the chat box. The first one is, what would it take to get Lordville averaging 68 max?
It would past analysis indicates that that is infeasible, that's an amount of water that New York City and the decree parties would not authorize. I don't have the numbers on the top of my head, but they're in reports that CEF made to RFAC back in June of 2019. I don't know if Jeff or others would remember what the numbers are exactly.
After I talk, I'll put the link to the reports in the chat.
Thanks, Amy. I'll just jump in real quick. We have a couple other questions I want to get to, but that question is, as Peter said, for FUDR and TU, the biggest question hovering over this whole program, and we don't have enough time. We could spend a lot of time on that, and that deserves a larger discussion. And I know, Walter, that's on your mind. Thank you for asking the question, and we're happy to follow up with you and have a little bit more detailed discussion about that beyond what Peter was able to do in that short time here. Molly, do you want to keep going with?
Sure. So I see Joseph Ancher asked about the Rivermaster website, and Amy Shallcross actually put the link to the website just below that for anybody that wants to look. So if there are any follow-up questions about that, just, type that question in.
Yeah, let me just say on that, it's a little bit tricky on that website to get the information relative to thermal relief and the other things we're concerned with. You have to click on the button on the upper right, that's FUD, that's FFMP. So you go to the FFMP page, and on that FFMP page, there's reference to a whole bunch of tables and useful data.
Okay, thank you. So then Bridget is asking, I understand the need for thermal releases, but why were the releases so high throughout September? Oh, and I see Brennan has addressed that somewhat in text, but is there anything else you want to say about that, Brennan?
No, I think in the second half of September is when the rule curve really starts going down. And that's why you saw those max capacity releases. But that's according to the FFMP. Part of it is to promote voids to help capture storm surges and potentially mitigate flood effects downstream. So yeah, there's a reason for that. That's according to the FFMP, and yeah.
Let me jump in, Molly. I know there's one more question.
Yep.
Bridget, for all these questions, these are such big issues and voluminous topics. We are happy to follow up with you and and get folks on the phone who can give you more detailed discussions if, Brennan's, brief answer here is not enough for you. So just let us know. Go ahead, Molly.
Okay, so the last question we have in the chat box is from Dan Plummer. He's saying, hey, Peter, New York City DEP and New York State DEC agree our area is getting wetter. Are you seeing that in your data, and how can that help us going forward? And then he clarified, due to climate change.
Yes, I think we see it, but as you know, being a statistician, I don't take small amounts of evidence as being anything totally definitive. But what we know, and I'm a member of the Water Center at Columbia University, what we know is from the big global models, the anticipation is that the Northeast is going to be wetter, which is good. Bad news is that that wetness may come in episodes that may be troubling, more storms. So we have several things happening at the same time, which may be both helpful and hurtful. More water, higher temperatures, more episodes of storms. I think we see that. We think we see that this year. 2021 was a wet summer, basically. Whether that's an aberration or whether that's an indication of the long run, only the long run is going to tell us.
Okay, we're going to have to cut it off here. Thank you, Peter. Thank you, Brennan. Excellent. I hope that was useful and informative for our audience. We're right on schedule here. Thank you, Sherry and Molly. Peter, I think you got